Teach the truth.
No more lies.
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 My name is Chris Rogers. I'm here in a couple different capacities. You know, one, just as someone who believes in a quality, truthful education for all of our students, all of our community members. But additionally, bringing up a ton of history as well. I'm the program director at the Paul Robeson House and Museum in West Philadelphia, located at 50th and Walnut. And much of the work that we do there is about recovering the legacy of a Renaissance man, one who has, a direct connection to the greater Philadelphia area, and letting folks know about his contributions to the world. That he not only fought for, the equality and freedom of Black people within this country, but was able to make connections with that with movements happening all across the world, and saw these two things as one and the same. And for that reason, for his solidarity with people all across the world, for his unwillingness to say, if I'm traveling across the world, I'm going to speak up against the present injustices that are facing Negro peoples, the United States government really took out a campaign to erase him from history. And it is the work of everyday educators like myself, like Tamara, like the many people who are part of the Zen Education Project, many people who signed on the Teach Truth campaign, who keep the legacy of Robeson alive, because there's so much that he's been erased from. There was a campaign in Washington, D.C. that the Zen Education Project, taught me about, where fifth graders, right? Robeson is one of the sort of premier baritones of his time. And they tried to erase this brother from the music textbooks. So these fifth graders out of Washington, D.C., alongside their teacher, Ken Giles, put together a campaign where they learned about Robeson's life story, learned about the many different songs that he sung, how he traveled across the world, in particular how he went to Spain during the time of the Spanish Civil War and lifted up the call for anti-fascism at a time when the United States refused to take a stance against fascism. And they put together these letters to say, we need to be teaching everybody about Paul Robeson, right? So when I think about the types of things that the legislation that is happening, not only here in Pennsylvania, but all across this country is looking to sort of like dismantle, it's those sorts of projects, those ways that young people saw an empowered individual like Paul Robeson and the community of folks that he represented bring a level of truth and inquiry and questions about this doesn't have to be. The type of violence and injustice that we see every day doesn't have to exist. And created a plan, built art and music, and really built media institutions around it. Freedom Newspaper, who he started with Lorraine Hansberry, who also has a direct connection to Philadelphia, is it talks about the legacy of what type of work and what type of dreams and visions that we want to see come into the world.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to Ms. Anderson for inviting me today. My name is Taryn Flaherty. I'm one of the organizers for the state marker, actually, the 1967 walkout. Yes. Which I and many of my classmates had done as an independent project in high school. And so I'm sure many of you know what the walkouts were, but on November 17th, 1967, over 3,000 middle and high school students had walked out here to the former Board of Education building to demand an education that was culturally responsive and inclusive of a school district that was majority Black and brown students. And not only did they demand for Black studies to be mandated and for truth to be taught in schools, but they also had a vision for what education could and should be. They wrote a Black Student Bill of Rights, calling for a curriculum that really encapsulates the diversity and breadth of life and history. They demanded Black and brown educators who cared for them and inspired them and nourished them through their education. And they also demanded the right to Black student unions and an end to militarism in schools. And so to me and many of my classmates, the most amazing part of this work and this moment was that they took on the school district of Philadelphia. They took on Frank Rizzo, as children younger than me. And so these were its students who were tired of lies and suppression of history, specifically Black history, and became change makers at age 13, 14 to 17. And so when I was first reading about this history, I was really struck by how different all these newspapers represented the students at this time. In Black media, such as like the Philadelphia Tribune, students were rightfully hailed as heroes, and Rizzo's brutality was rightfully called out. But in mainstream white media, the students were actually accused of being agitators and provoking violence, and were called rioters and delinquents. And today we see many of the same issues, especially in 2020 when the discussion of the Frank Rizzo statue came up, a literal commemoration of white supremacy. Many classmates and I and young people across the city had protested his statue. His legacy of police brutality became something to be debated, as his terrorism of Black communities, the Black Panthers, the MOVE organization, the 1967 students, and much of youth around the city. His history of violence became disregarded by his supporters. And so, especially as we stand in front of the Board of Education building, which is now luxury apartments, it speaks volumes to say that there is nothing but just recently this marker to commemorate what has happened here and how groundbreaking that was for many people. And so I, along with 4 of my other public school classmates, set out to set the record straight. We wrote a 113-page application to ensure this marker be accepted, not only because of its historical significance, but also because of its inspiration to us and as individuals and activists and so many people across the nation, actually. In the creation of this marker, we honor the student activists, the elders, the organizers, and the true change makers who believed in education, justice, and a youth-led Black Power movement who changed our city and inspired us all. We honor a history of resistance and young people's demand for a voice in their education. This was definitely the most challenging, rigorous, and intense 4 months of my life applying for this, but we really had to do justice to the story of these elders and these student activists who demanded a voice in their education, and a story that has been so often mistold, misrepresented for so long. And so this state marker and all the work behind it is really a physical manifestation, I would say, of what can happen when truth is taught in schools, when students learn about themselves and our full nation's history, when our education brings us these exceptional moments of that inspire us and that makes us curious to learn more and to discover more. And I can definitely attest, as somebody who is now a history major and working on archiving more of Philadelphia's history, of the MOVE organization, along with other my classmates, can all attest that these inspirational stories like the 67 walkouts are able to really reinvent our thinking and our understanding of our own roles and our history. And so as we fight for CRT in schools, cultural and ethnic studies on school board meetings and college campuses, as educators are really demanded nowadays for quality teaching, as we specifically in Pennsylvania are facing a crisis for our city schools to be well funded and supported by the state of Pennsylvania, we find that the story of the 1967 students, organizers, their entire moment is really more relevant than ever. And so today is a reminder that history is not just an echo, it's an urgent reminder of the injustices right before our very eyes, and it remains a call to action. As CRT is under attack across our country, we look towards our educators, our student activists, our organizers, and our change makers to continue the fight for education justice and inspire a new generation of change. So thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to join this gathering. I have chills being here because we're standing, we're teaching, we're learning in front of the 1967 Black Student Walkout's historic marker. This time last year, this wasn't here, right? And so I'm just in awe and in deep appreciation of the organizing work that led to this moment and the organizing work that this marker represents. So, as Tamara mentioned, I'm Dr. Krystal Strong. I am a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the Graduate School of Education. My work focuses on studying and communicating what we can learn from young people's activism, from students' activism globally. But I'm also an organizer. I'm an organizer with Black Lives Matter in Philadelphia. We have organized so many marches down this parkway, and we didn't have the opportunity to stop in front of this important site because there was no historic marker, but now we do. And I also had the great pleasure of offering support that was not needed, but was gladly offered to the 5 incredible, at the time, juniors at Masterman High School, including Taryn, as they were working towards the process, the deep and rigorous and in its own right worthy of appreciation process of advocating for and eventually winning this marker. And so I just feel like I want us to celebrate this for just a moment. Yeah. This is a victory. Woo. This is a victory. We have so many more radical histories, Black histories in the city of Philadelphia that do not have acknowledgement and recognition. So the fact that this one does is something that we shouldn't ever lose sight of how important and powerful and just the way that opens up for more of this kind of work. I just don't want to lose the novelty and importance of that. And what I want to really focus my comments on right now is, Taryn, who I am very glad to continue working with around archiving radical histories, Black histories in the city of Philadelphia. She's really not giving you the full picture of the work that it took to make this happen. And so I would like to really acknowledge that in this space. And I also want to sort of tie together the global significance of the 1967 student walkout and what this opens up for us. So in this beautiful marker is relatively recent, right? We dedicated this just a few months ago here in 2022, but I received an email from one of Taryn's classmates, Nia, in August 2019, just to give you a sense of how long this process goes back, and it stretches back even further than that, as a matter of fact. But this is the email that I received, and I would just like to read it for you all because I think it kind of represents on its own the deep level of work and integrity that went into this process. So this is what it said. We are juniors from J.R. Masterman High School in Philadelphia. We are working as a team this fall to submit an application for a Pennsylvania historical landmark commemorating the 1967 Black student walkout. This past school year, we each competed individually in the National History Day competition, winning in regionals, states, and for some, even nationals. 2 of the projects focused on the Philadelphia 1967 student walkouts and the subsequent events that affected not only Philadelphia, but the civil rights movement as a whole. The push for the plaque stems from a learned appreciation for local history and our hope that the state will recognize the role of young people during this time. We feel that those who risked their lives and partook in the walkout deserve recognition for their contribution to the nation's history. And it was signed Nia, Taryn, Tatiana, Allison, and Aiden. And I just love coming back to these words because you all are just so, apart from being just so sweet and hopeful, just so purposeful about what you hoped this process would lead to, right? And I think that's worthy of really appreciating. And so after being reached out to by these incredible students, I happen to be teaching a class that I offer at Penn called Activism Beyond the Classroom. And that class in and of itself is a collaboration between students at Penn, but also students around the city of Philadelphia, but also educators. Like, we've worked with the Caucus of Working Educators in the past. And also, it is really meant to tie strengthen the ties between the classroom and our local movements. And so it was perfectly fitting to have Taryn and her classmates join our classroom, and it became a space where the work that they had already been done could be supported and also learned from by graduate students, college students, and myself. And so in the course of that process, these incredible students shared the deep historical research that they had done. You didn't mention this, but the oral histories you yourself conducted with students who participated in the walkouts, a lot of archival research. I mean, you don't just wake up one day and write 100 and how many pages? 113 pages, right? And so I just want to put an emphasis on the high level of just educational practice, pedagogical practice, learning practices that were embedded in this process. And I also want to take us back to the dedication of this marker itself. We were here, we took over this entire street behind us. You know, all of the former Masterman students who submitted this application were here, but there were also students, former students who participated in the walkout who came from all over the country to be back here, to relive what they experienced that day. Many of them talked about how painful it still is to remember, you know, the simple things that they were demanding: culturally relevant pedagogy, an educational experience that actually meets their needs, that relates to their lived experiences, that support the broader struggles that their communities are embedded within. This is not rocket science, right? Like, these are not things that we should still be demanding now in 2022 with the Teach the Truth campaign.
Hi, I'm Kristen Luberg. I've been a teacher in Philadelphia public schools for more than 20 years, and I want to thank organizers and Tamara for asking me to speak today as well. So, when we talk about Teach Truth, what does it mean to teach truth to our students? Why is it important that we tell the entire unvarnished history of this nation and this world to our students? Beyond the obvious fact that, of course, it's the truth and they need to know it, we know that when we shade our truth the way some of the most traditional teaching of our history does, what Taryn was just saying about the way the papers portrayed this action, the white papers portrayed the action, we create and we feed a profound cognitive dissonance in our students, especially our Black, Indigenous, and students of color. Our students know their history, the fights and the triumphs their ancestors have engaged in. They also know what they see and what they experience in their own lives every day. To ignore, deny, downplay these realities and this history is an insidious form of gaslighting. It sends a message that our students' histories and lived experiences are irrelevant or unimportant. They know, and we should know, that our history is full of the contributions of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian Pacific Islander peoples. To deny this truth, these many truths, is to negate and bury the real truth of this country. And it's also to deny the very humanity and agency of the people whose histories we don't teach about. So in addition to what was won after many, many years after this walkout, we need to expand our teaching of history to include, in addition to our African American history courses in Indigenous studies for Native peoples, Latinx peoples, Asian American Pacific Islander peoples as well. We need to commit to teaching the full and true history of our country in every history class we offer. And we need to keep fighting the people who don't want the truth to be told.
In many ways, the 67 student walkout brings together so many of the threads that we continue to struggle around between an educational system that does not meet the needs of Black and brown youth in particular, of a city that is rapidly changing and pushing out Black communities, poor communities in particular, of a police state that still does not serve the needs of our communities, but is always ready to meet resistance particularly Black resistance, with the full force of the militarized state. We are still having that conversation, and we ought to trace it in part back to this moment of the 1967 Black student walkouts. This historic marker allows us to do that. It allows us to gather in community to remember this leadership of young people, right? But also to extend that work. This is itself a representation and recognition of young people's, and particularly students' leadership, right? The process of creating this marker, it is an intergenerational process that actually mirrors what it is celebrating, right? So it's, again, students' leadership that allows us to celebrate these young people's and students' leadership, right? And I'm also just imagining and encouraging us to continue to hold this space, to continue to come back to what is now luxury apartments, right? The city of Philadelphia, like many cities, turns its historic locations, sites of historic significance, into places that represent everything that is changing about the city, everything that is making the city unlivable for the people that are from here. And so I think it is incredibly important that we are here taking up this space, right? We are sitting on the edge of this property that was once a public property but is now private property. And we need to continue to do that. And in fact, we need to figure out collectively as educators of students who are able to lead this work, where are our next historic marker sites that we're going to struggle around?